Today our guest is Louie Greek from Truckers Against Trafficking, also known as TAT. We'll be talking with Louie about what human trafficking looks like along our roadways, what companies, communities, and individuals can do to help combat human trafficking right in their own communities, and we'll also talk with Louie about TAT's man-to-man campaign addressing demand for commercial sex. Join us today with Louie Greek.
We need to put words to the fact that there's something broken about our understanding and definition of masculinity and manhood. So for me, it was really important to come to terms with this fact that I was lying to myself, but I think what is even more foundational is the fact that we as men are being lied to. We're being lied to about what it means to be a man, but we're also being lied to about the impact and the consequences on women for our exploits and for our using women, whether we're paying for sex or not.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Louie Greek.
Thank you so much, Penny. It's really a pleasure to be here and connect with your audience.
Oh, thank you so much. And we're so happy to have you here, Louie, and so proud of the work that TAT's done. And to start off, can you describe to our listeners what sex trafficking looks like along America's roadways, at truck stops, interstate rest areas, parking lots, hotels, motels, and other areas associated with the trucking industry?
Yeah. I think a lot of times with our TV shows, some of our movies that are out there, we get a misconception of what human trafficking looks like, specifically domestic sex trafficking along America's roadways. Of course, we do have transnational human trafficking that happens on both of our borders, but to make it clear, a lot of those that are vulnerable and being exploited along our roadways, such as truck stops, travel centers, bus stops, are a lot of times American boys and girls that were born right here in the United States, and oftentimes marginal individuals. And it could be from rural indigenous communities or populations. They can be from urban areas where there's not a lot of parental involvement or guidance. Or maybe this could be an adult who is having challenges through economics or maybe substance abuse, and a trafficker takes advantage of that. And what we often see are individuals at places like a truck stop where they're forced to go and solicit from those drivers out there. And when we talk about target industries and combating human trafficking, specifically with the transportation industry, we notice that a lot of those roles and positions, including drivers and frontline workers, are oftentimes filled by males or a male dominated industry. And so traffickers see this as an opportunity to really kind of exploit that industry. However, through our work, through the partnerships of the industries, we've been able to combat that by recognizing some of those red flag indicators. Maybe you're at a location and you see an individual that's dressed inappropriately for the weather. So it's a cold day in Montana, and you have an individual that might be wearing a skirt or maybe a tank top. Or you also see that individual that might be with somebody that is displaying controlling behaviors or manipulative behaviors. Or you see that same individual approaching different vehicles or trucks throughout that lot there at that travel center or truck stop. And maybe one or two of those indicators may not necessarily mean human trafficking, but when you start looking at some of those indicators, and there's a few there, we'll talk about those as we dive deeper into our training and resources. But you're able to see potential individuals, vulnerable individuals that are exploited at locations such as our roadways, with challenges in the economic situation in our country of a lot of individuals that are on the brink of homelessness or being unhoused. Oftentimes, this is an opportunity, again, for traffickers to exploit an individual. Sometimes that could be even family members that are exploiting that individual into domestic sex trafficking. And then we also have to recognize just the important roles that those frontline employees really play, whether that be a driver or, a gas station employee or the law enforcement that we work with. We have to really realize that trafficking doesn't always look like the pictures that we see on the internet of an individual that has their hands bound or bruises. Oftentimes it's hidden in plain sight right in front of us. You wouldn't think, especially in a state like Montana, that human trafficking is happening in some of those places. But through our partnership with not only task forces, Montana government, as well as law enforcement, we've heard of case studies where this does happen, on a very frequent basis. We really have to change our mentality and our concept or views of what we think human trafficking looks like to what it really looks like along our roadways. And again, I mentioned a lot of those potential victims are American boys and girls that are trafficked right here.
So true, Louie, so true. And we think about states like Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, really the center of America, which we typically would think of as our more rural states. And those are going to be very long stretches of driving time. And one of the things we see in one of the geographically largest states in our country are those long driving stretches are rarely monitored by law enforcement. And that's where we see in many of the rural communities that we work with our task force, that's where we see trafficking happening. It's not just an urban crime. It is a rural crime as well that's happening because the lack of law enforcement, the lack of funding, the lack of understanding that something like this type of a crime could actually be happening in a rural community. With the trucking industry, there's been so many outstanding impacts that have been happening within that industry and to really address sex trafficking. And I think one of the greatest things that TAT does, certainly some of the most powerful videos that I'm seeing being put out there, is the voice of survivors and the voice of victims. So can you describe to us and tell us how the voices of survivors guide the direction or work of TAT?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, too. I've been working in the anti-human trafficking space for over 10 years, and Truckers Against Trafficking TAT has been around for about 15 years. And as an organization and me personally, we've realized that the perspective and voice of a survivor is really key into understanding the dynamics of this crime. My background comes from law enforcement and military, but from a law enforcement perspective, and you mentioned before, about the lack of training. I think they say about less than 20% of law enforcement have received formal training on this issue. And so, again, just such an important role. I think traditionally law enforcement looked at this crime differently and oftentimes arrested or looked at that victim as someone that was committing a crime, not really focusing on the buyer and trafficker. And so as we've worked with survivors, as we've heard their voice, we've realized that one, they are a victim, and they're important to understanding how the dynamics of this crime works. When we talk about what human trafficking looks like across our country, we're looking at things, especially when it comes to individual that is either being forced or coerced or defrauded into performing these sex acts. And so now hearing from a survivor's voice to not only tell that to law enforcement or law enforcement partners that this is what's happening to them, this is the manipulative tactics that traffickers are using, helps law enforcement have a better understanding on how to approach the crime, how to work with potential survivors or potential victims there, as well as ensuring that there's prosecution towards traffickers as well as buyers. The other thing, too, of hearing from a survivor and why it's so important for our videos, for our materials and resources, because we are very fortunate to have a few survivors on our staff here at Truckers Against Trafficking. And the benefit of that is not only, as I mentioned, as they travel with myself and others on the team to hear that voice, but that perspective of what it was like for them to be exploited a truck stop or along our roadways, which is just really key in hearing these drivers understand about what that looks like, what they could be looking for, as they pull into those gas stations or those travel centers, as they're driving along the road. If they see a potential individual that might be displaying some of those red flag indicators that are referenced in our resources. And so the survivors are just crucial to really fighting the fight against human trafficking. We've got to listen to their voices. And I think in the past, we weren't as good as that, especially in the law enforcement government area. But now, what we call our victim-centered approach, the way government, service providers, law enforcement are approaching this crime, is really lifting up that potential trafficking victim, hearing their story, even though it might be covered in layers of trauma, abuse, fear, and those various tactics that traffickers have instilled on that individual. So Again, to your question, I would like to say that, without those survivors, I think that the pillar of our mission would really struggle or collapse because we need to hear from that voice. We need to hear that perspective of people that have been in those circumstances and those situations because when they're telling their story, when they're able to be vulnerable and sharing with our audience, with the transportation and trucking community, about what it looked like for them to be out there at those locations, really resonates with those drivers and frontline workers about the role that they play and the impact that they can make on an individual like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And we're going to talk about one of the videos, which I just had chills and literally had to pause one of the TAT videos just the other day. I was so overcome with emotions. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But in all of your videos, you do such a great job educating folks on a specific subject. You integrate that survivor voice into that subject matter and provide multiple perspectives from that, which I think is so important because you tapped on that when you talked about how law enforcement used to perceive what we would say prostitution, which I think that the majority of us in anti-trafficking work would say that 90+% of prostitution is forced. And these are victims. They're victim workers. They're not sex workers. They're victim workers. There used to be a whole title really that we would perceive this type of law enforcement because we saw it on TV all the time. They were called the Vice Squad. They were the ones out there on the street, arresting the girls. And these victims, they became criminals. And so it really is that paradigm shift of work that's been done, I would say, within the last 10 years by folks like all of you at TAT, by Peter Qualiotine, who both of us know and I think we both admire greatly. When we've taken a different look and a different approach at how we listen to the voice of the victim and survivor and how we perceive that body and that human being, it's created a paradigm shift. So you all have developed this program called Freedom Drivers, which I just love and think it's brilliant. So talk to us about the Freedom Drivers program, the work being done by truck drivers to combat sex trafficking in their industry. And if you can, please share some stories.
Yeah, we are absolutely so proud of our drivers and frontline workers. They saw something and they said something. They really are the eyes and ears of our nation's roadways. And I do want to make a point here. Although we do see sex buying in the trucking industry, we see that in many industries. It's a very small percentage of the industry. The majority of the trucking industry, these are family individuals. These are people that care about the places that they work and the communities that they serve. And so the majority of those drivers and frontline workers out there want to make a difference. And so, through attending our training, whether that be during a safety meeting or online orientation, they'll go through our half an hour documentary style type training and get informed about what to look for and how to report that. And so we have numerous accounts over the years of our freedom drivers, of our what we call our Harriet Tubman Award winners, of these frontline workers that saw those indicators, weren't so sure, but decided to make a phone call, and it resulted in the recovery of a potential victim and the arrest of traffickers. And to give you a few of the examples there, I want to one talk about one of our most popular one was Kevin Kimmel. He was at a truck stop in Virginia pulling in there to take his break. He's kind of filling out his paperwork. He recently went through our TAT training online. He had the app, so I just want to let listeners know that we do have an app for Android and iPhone if you look under Truckers Against Trafficking. And as he's there, filling out his paperwork, he notices that there was an RV, kind of looked a little beat up, was in the lot with the rest of the trucks, typically not supposed to be parked there. That's a little unusual. You did see, a couple different guys going to and from that RV. That's another indicator, but not necessarily something towards, human trafficking, but his senses are up based on the training. But as when there was a young girl kind of peeped her head out the back window, only to kind of have it violently snatched back and the curtains drawn its place, where Kevin was like, boy, this just doesn't seem right. And what I want to encourage listeners out there, and what we encourage a lot of our drivers, to make that call. Even if you're not too sure, call local law enforcement, call either the state task force number, or the National Human Trafficking Hotline number, your call can really make a difference. And so Kevin's call there was able to get law enforcement out there, and went up to that RV. Comes to find out that the two owners of that RV were actually trafficking a young woman through multiple states. They had met her online, coerced her, groomed her, and were able to separate her from her family and then start trafficking across the country. And they'd stop at locations like truck stops and travel centers. No one suspected anything was unusual because they used various tactics, including, beatings, horrible assaults, where she was afraid to talk to law enforcement. They also forced her to take pictures, take selfies, send text messages back to family members at home, telling them that she was fine, she's just on a road trip. And so family members didn't even realize that there was something going on behind the scenes there. So because of the actions of that driver, because he decided to take a few extra moments, observe the situation, and give law enforcement a call, were they able to reunite that young girl with her parents? They also, those two traffickers are spending 40 years in prison right now for a sentence. So that's just one of the examples. I do want to bring up another example that we had just in your part of the country in Idaho. One of our drivers was trained by our Truckers Against Trafficking, new trucking company in the state of Idaho. And the driver was driving kind of almost on the state line, a pretty rural area. And he actually saw a young female that was walking down the highway, and she actually just had a towel on. Thought this was really unusual. He did not have cell phone service. He was actually in a pretty rural area. Now, based on his company policy, he did not pick up that passenger. But as soon as he did get within range and cell phone range, he did call law enforcement. Law enforcement was able to go out there and intercept a young individual who was being exploited and being trafficked. And again, we're talking about an extremely rural part of our country along a roadway. And all because a driver saw this, thought it was unusual, instead of just, not doing anything about it, as soon as they were able to get to service, they were able to call local law enforcement. Because those drivers can really be those eyes and ears, because we can train, empower, and mobilize these frontline workers, we are actually seeing a difference. We've trained over 1.6 million drivers across North America. And I can assure you, if you ever have an opportunity to check out our website, those are just two of many case examples of where those frontline workers are just making a difference in the lives of potential victims across our country.
Oh, that's such a great example of what you just said. You see something and you say something, and you bring up a really good point. And as someone who has driven around the center of America, there is a vast part of our country that still has no cell phone service. You know that there are places in these mountain states and in these plain states where they're still not up to really 2024 standards of what we see in more populated states in regard to being able to just have that type of cell service. And one of the things that you said that I think is so important and that we really work to get that message out is it's still absolutely critical to call that local number. When you get within that cell phone range or you get to a place that you can make a call or you see something, it is critically important to call that local number because that reduces that response time for that victim to get someone there. As much as we love the work that Polaris does with the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and we think that that work is so critical, for us, we say that first phone call really needs to be local. Get the local law enforcement involved as soon as possible. So really, thank you for making that point when you were telling that story. Now, you brought up one of my heroes in life, and that's Harriet Tubman. And I know that she's a hero for many people. TAT presents that award named after Harriet Tubman to individuals who have helped victims of human trafficking escape or connect to resources. And for many of us, we understand and know human trafficking is modern day slavery. So this award is so appropriately named, and what an honor. Tell us about the award. When do you give out the award? How is it decided who gets this award? And if you have any other stories, share those stories also. This is truly a wonderful recognition.
Yeah. So traditionally, it's been provided. So Protective Insurance, who just was bought out by Progressive Insurance, would at their annual conference be able to recognize that driver and typically, a family member. So sometimes we've had spouses join them at Progressive's annual conference. They receive a $2,500 cash prize as well. And in the past, they've had tickets to Indy 500. So
Wow.
it's
That's a
been
that's a big
really,
deal.
yeah, it really is a big deal. And, I mean, our drivers are motivated because they care about the community they work with, but it's a great incentive for them to, keep their eyes out, to keep looking on the road. It's a great incentive for companies as well to encourage their drivers to always keep an eye out, to always be looking out there for those signs, those indicators of vulnerable individuals that might be exploited. So if you have a nomination out there, a company or an individual that has made a call on behalf of a potential victim that has resulted in either kind of arrest or recovery, we'd love to hear about it. We're always looking for new candidates to really just kind of celebrate their efforts, both as an individual and as a company, taking the extra mile. To give you another example of one, and this actually is in Montana. This was maybe 2 years ago. We had a store clerk that just went through our training. A young girl came into that truck stop. She was kind of a little discombobulated. She actually had her shoes in her hands, a couple other items of clothing, but went up to that cashier and said that the person that she was with wasn't taking her to where she wanted to go. They had taken all of her belongings and kind of left her there. And so they were like, well, this doesn't seem right. From the perspective of some of these frontline workers at travel centers, they do run into semi-transient people, sometimes, challenging people. But this store clerk decided to give a different look. They decided not to shoo them off their property and they decided to call local law enforcement. They were able to provide this young lady with an area, a break room to sit in, provided her some water, a couple snacks while law enforcement was getting there. Because they noticed just while she was at that location that there was other men trying to approach her at that location. Law enforcement did arrive on scene. They were able to take her into custody, unhandcuffed, and provide her medical services. Comes to find out that she was actually drugged by that guy that had taken her to that truck stop. They ran her name in a database and they were able to connect with family out of the Seattle, Washington area and was able to connect with dad. Dad was like, she was working in the front yard, she was working on her car. Next thing you know, she disappeared. And I can tell you, folks and listeners today, we hear a lot of these stories. You hear a lot of these stories in the news where young people and young individuals disappear. It's not always the snatching off the street. Sometimes a lot of this happens online. We haven't even talked about it. A lot of this happens online in the online aspect. But these things do happen. And when we are able to train frontline workers, store workers, convenience store workers, drivers, and they have this new understanding and perspective of what human trafficking looks like, when we have a store clerk like that who comes across a situation, they just simply make a phone call and look at the results there. They're able to reunite this young girl back with her family and really prevent any more exploitation. So that's an example of just another award winner going the extra mile and when they see something and saying something.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. And that's one of the things that we really emphasize over and over again as well is that human trafficking domestically in the United States is not the movie Taken. And it's not the movie The Sound of Freedom. It is predominantly a family member who is causing harm by selling a family member for whatever reason it may be. And it can be a variety of reasons. Can something like what you described, where someone is taken, does that happen? Yes, that can happen. But is that the predominance of human trafficking that we see domestically in the United States? And it's not. Predominantly what we see with victims the first time they're trafficked, it's typically by someone they know, love, or trust. And those are some of the things that we emphasize over and over again. So thank you for continuing to emphasize that, but also for sharing a story of something that happened to this particular victim. So can it happen? Yes, it can happen. Is it the typical way that someone's trafficked? It isn't. And you said something early on as well, and it's a word we use often. This is an invisible crime. It is something that's literally happening right in front of you, but you might not know that's what you're seeing. Victims have been so brainwashed, psychologically kidnapped or trained to not give eye contact, to not speak out, to wait and allow the individual with them to do all the communicating for them. But they've really been taught to just blend in. And I'll share with you and our listeners one of the cases that we had here in Montana, and thankfully he was convicted and is now serving many, many, many years in prison. But his name was Terrence Edwards, and he had multiple trafficking victims through 3 different states, one of them being Montana, some of them being minors. And in the case study done by the FBI, Terrence Edwards had had his victims in 40 different public locations in Billings alone, coffee shops, hotels, restaurants, Walmarts, the 5 and dime stores, public locations where there's people all over, and they're counting on us to not be paying attention. They're counting on us to be ingrained in what we're thinking in our heads, the white noise of what we're hearing. We're thinking about our day and we're just going about our business, and they're counting on us not paying attention to what's happening around us. Now we're approaching the subject that is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. And the video that I watched the other night that had me in tears is the demand side and addressing demand and doing something in our country to look at human trafficking in a different way and helping us to look at the buyer versus putting all of the responsibility to ending human trafficking on the victim, which is what we did for many years. We put so much responsibility on the victim to reduce the vulnerabilities, but the real responsibility for trafficking really sits with that buyer. TAT has a program out now called Man to Man, which is addressing the demand side to human trafficking. And then, of course, the word demand is a one-word description for buying commercial sex. And while there are female buyers, the vast majority of commercial sex buyers are men. So tell us about the man-to-man program TAT has implemented to address demand and how you are measuring the program's success.
Yeah, so one of my roles here at TAT is to kind of lead up our man-to-man program. This is something new for me, although I've been in the fight of human trafficking for a while. From this perspective is very new for me. And what I've really learned and what I really want to focus on the audience today is that if there was no buyer, you would actually have no victim and you'd have no sex trafficking. When we are trying to fight the crime of human trafficking, we can train law enforcement, we can have community members report this as much as possible, and we can round up those traffickers, get them off the street. But the next day, we're going to have a whole new set of traffickers. Why? It's that demand for commercial sex. It's that demand that's really fueling this crime. And traffickers, they would sell something else, such as drugs or arms, but they know that there is a market for people. And sadly, as individuals, it's different than a drug where you can use one time. Individuals can be used over and over. And so they see the marketability of exploiting humans because male buyers are really fueling this because they're going out, they're saying, "Hey, I want this," or "I'm looking for this," or they're whether it be online or in person, they're creating that demand, and so that trafficker has to find somebody that they can fill that demand. Oftentimes, not a willing participant. And in that the demand aspect, in trying to really focus on that, we also have to talk about just the online aspect of that too. Where the demand for commercial sex has always existed and for a long period of time, and realizing that that might have been an acceptable behavior in our society. Some of the jokes that we said, some of our behaviors, going to strip clubs, engaging in commercial sex, and thinking that is a behavior that's acceptable and it's not causing harm is a huge mistake. What we've realized in fighting the issue of human trafficking is that if we address the demand aspect, if we stop having buyers participating, doing those certain acts, then that actually really has the largest impact on stopping this crime and from individuals being exploited. And so we've really focused with our Man to Man campaign in our Addressing Demand video on this message, in particular to not only just community groups, but men in particular. This could be faith based community groups, sports leagues, and just trying to change our conversation, trying to change mentalities and behaviors that traditionally have been accepted as normalized behaviors to realize that they're on a continuum of harm or exploitation that happens oftentimes to women, women of color, or marginalized individuals and populations. So really focusing on that, providing, that training video, which is a good additional resource that we have. I really encourage listeners to watch that video. If you go to our website and you click on the demand tab, we also have brochures, wallet cards, and other additional webinars and resources to just continue this conversation. Because if you're a catalyst and you're an abolitionist to fight human trafficking, which you probably are if you're listening to this podcast, I truly feel that the biggest way to make some impact is to have this conversation, to talk about the demand piece, to share it among your friends, your family members, and colleagues, these resources and this message on specifically addressing where this starts. I want to touch on the pornography aspect because this has really changed the dynamics of human trafficking. I can tell you that online piece with the dawn of the internet and now criminals utilizing that kind of piece of technology, human trafficking has exploded. Traditionally in the past, where someone's had to go to maybe a hotel, a strip club, or some other specific location to engage with that individual, they no longer have to go to those in-person places. That one makes it harder for community members as law enforcement to track that. It also makes them easier to engage in this type of activity where they can go online, they can see these types of things advertised. Additionally, they don't even have to engage in actual physical sex acts. Again, pornography, they just go to those websites. These websites are tracking these views. They put that at monetary value, whether you go to a free or paid site. And so there, that's generating that demand, that money. The United States, I believe, has one of the largest child pornography industries in the world. And so, again, these are adults who are now looking for vulnerable populations, underage individuals that are coercing, defrauding, or tricking them, particularly online at places like Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram, where they're looking for these vulnerable individuals, grooming them over a period of time, and then once they get them into kind of their grips, they're now advertising those individuals online. And so this whole process of human exploitation through the dawn of the internet and through pornography has really fueled this. I mean, when you think about it, many individuals from the privacy of their home that they can get on their cell phones or their computers have no idea the impact of that other individual on that screen that they're looking at may not be a willing participant in that act. They may have their child being held against them if they don't perform those sex acts. Maybe they were promised to do something there and they were given a drug and weren't really making the conscious or coherent decisions. Maybe they were promised monetary value and they weren't given that. And so I really want to emphasize to the role that the online and pornography play in human trafficking as well as on the demand aspect. And so I could probably talk for forever on our man to man campaign, but without, kind of telling you everything, I encourage you to take that opportunity to look at that video. As an abolitionist, this is to really further our work and to look deeper at how we can really stop this crime at its root cause, where it begins. And I truly do believe it does come from having these conversations. Even for someone like myself who's never engaged in commercial sex, but grew up in environments of law enforcement, military, male dominated industries, I was used to the jokes that happen around there. I didn't think much of it. When I started working in law enforcement, I would see oftentimes where fathers would take their sons to strip clubs or other areas of Las Vegas, thinking that would induct them into manhood, not realizing that the harm that plays and contributes to this normalized behavior of exploitation. So we need to have conversations of where we bring in authentic masculinity, where we talk about ways that we treat each other, regardless of gender, the actions that we take, and just have conversations. And I can assure you, and we've seen it in our programs, that when a task force plays our addressing demand video in their community and that they see that at their church or they play it at a sports league afterwards or just hanging out and kind of seeing the ripple effect of their community of people just changing that mentality, having that conversation, and really probably one of the most important things is having that conversation with the youth, boys and girls. When you're talking to young men about, sexuality, healthy behaviors towards sexuality, where to learn about that, and where the harm that they can play if they go through other areas of influence that they may see from peers, as well as young women too. I think our youth have a tendency to get their understanding about sexuality and sex from the internet, and sometimes in unhealthy ways. And so there might be unhealthy ways that young girls may see themselves in regards to what their expectation is in a sexual relationship. And so I know it's a tough conversation, but this is key to really fighting human trafficking. In my law enforcement career, when I started law enforcement about 20 years ago, the big thing was talking about domestic violence, which we didn't talk about a lot. And over the years, we've slowly and steadily changed in our society about, hey, these behaviors in regards to verbal abuse, physical abuse to each other, to women, to marginalized individuals, it can't be accepted. We can't see that as normalized behavior. And so our next trend is talking about human trafficking and the demand for that domestic sex trafficking. Because once we can really convince our communities, once we can convince our society that these types of behaviors and conversations cause harm, then I really think that we can start seeing a change in curbing this crime from growing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think one of the things that's done so well in that video is the conversation that Peter Qualiotine has with this small group of men on toxic masculinity, and what the men participating in that video talking about the pressure that was on them as young men to be hypersexualized males, to be aggressive males sexually, and how to view females in that sexual manner. And that was taught, and there was that pressure that was put on them to be that type of a dominant male. It's such a brilliant conversation, and one that I'm definitely putting into the training that I do. And I think that this really goes towards the conversation also that we eventually need to start having within our country too, is the difference between consent and mutuality. Consent is a legal word and a legal term. Just because someone doesn't say no, does that mean they've really given consent? By law, the law may say, well, there were actions in place that showed consent. But what we really need to come back to and come down to and start really getting to the bottom of in that conversation is that when there is an intimacy sexually between two people, is it really about consent? Shouldn't it be about mutuality? That both people are desiring to have that type of physical contact with one another. When we talk human trafficking, and I would say that 90+% of prostitution as well, that mutuality is not there. It's not there. In some cases, the law may be able to say, well, we can show consent was there. Mutuality was not there. And that's part of that toxic masculinity, and redefining what masculinity means is the desire for mutuality. And that desire for mutuality should be there, where the other person desires you as much physically and intimately in a sexual way as you are wanting to have that experience with them. So I hope that we can start moving our country in that direction as well. So Louie, as we wrap up, share with our listeners how to find TAT resources and what companies, communities, and individuals can do to help fight human trafficking right where they live.
So as I mentioned, the transportation industry is really taking ownership of this. We have partners like Amazon, UPS, large truck stops out there that realize and value the importance of keeping their industry safe. And as I mentioned, the majority of those that work within that industry really care about the work that they do and the communities that they serve. And so we've been fortunate to partner with these industries as a nonprofit. We're fully funded by the industry. So our corporate sponsors, all our materials, my time today, is all given back from that trucking and transportation industry. And so we have a plethora of resources that are out there. If you go to our website, truckersagainsttrafficking.org, you'll see the different programs that we have up there. You'll also see a tab for resources and materials. We have materials in Spanish, English, French, Canadian, and those vary from the different programs and niche specific within the transportation industry. So it could be local drivers that maybe just be driving there in Montana. It could be over the road that go to various states. We have training specifically for law enforcement or maybe Department of Transportation employees, school bus drivers, energy industries. And so, again, we have a plethora of resources. And those stem from just that 30-minute training video, which I encourage everybody to kind of watch the general one there, to pieces of paper that go in your pockets, purses, and hands out there that kind of just remind you of the role that you play. Some of those red flag indicators that are specific to what it looks like on our roadways, and then things to report to law enforcement. Things like descriptions of individuals, descriptions of vehicles, makes, models, license plate numbers. All these types of things are really important that when you are reporting human trafficking, and again, I want to say when you're reporting that to really emphasize you think you see human trafficking, this will really kind of initiate a different response for law enforcement out there. And so those resources, those tools are all free, both printed and digital. So I want to let you know that those are free resources. If you have connections, whether you're an individual and you don't have to be in the transportation industry, but whether you're an individual or have family members or youth in your life or know other people that have nexuses and connections to the transportation industry, I really encourage you to have the conversation that we're having today and direct them to Truckers Against Trafficking. We have been fortunate to partner with task forces and organizations like Yellowstone County who have been force multipliers in getting our information out, where we as an organization can always get some of those touch points. And so we rely on listeners like today that are able to go out there and get some of our materials out in front of the communities that they live in and work in. And so we're always happy to send you those free materials. We're always happy to work with you on ways that you can implement and really kind of getting our resources into your anti-human trafficking efforts, specifically for the transportation industry in your communities and areas. So as individuals, there's a lot you can do. You can continue this conversation. You can train yourself on our training materials that are specific to the transportation industry, and just be aware. Keep an eye out for those signs and red flags that might indicate that trafficking is happening as you're driving to work, taking your kids to piano lesson, or on a family vacation across the United States. You really have an opportunity there. As I mentioned, if you're involved with a company out there or you know other companies, direct them to our organization. You're more than welcome to connect with Penny and get my email address. I'd be happy to connect with anybody out there on further efforts. And then along with the demand side, so that's what you can do as an individual, what you can do kind of in your workplace. But on the demand aspect, and just in the conversation again in regards to human trafficking, have these tough conversations with family members, with your loved ones who you care about. Really, that gives you an opportunity to protect them. And then continue this conversation. As mentioned, personally seen the ripple effects that have one, two, three individuals start to have these conversations and really change that cultural mind shift that we've been talking about. We really do have the ability to change the dynamics of human trafficking. We have the ability to be able to recover vulnerable individuals from being exploited or any future individuals being exploited. We just have to take the time to be observant and get involved. If we see something, to really say something. And I want to encourage, listeners out there, if they're hesitant, to just go ahead and make that call. We have seen where they're not too sure if they're seeing human trafficking, but that tip can really make a difference because that tip maybe become helpful a month down the road when someone else makes a call and they give a very similar description of an individual and they can start connecting the dots there. So your efforts in combating human trafficking do make a difference. And I really encourage you to go to our website and check out our resources. I also want to let parents know that we do have parent resources out there. I know this sometimes is a tough conversation. There's a lot of other organizations out there that provide those resources, but really talking to the next generation, our future out there, especially our youth, on how they can change things. Truly, I think we have an opportunity to change society and as a whole. But I really think where the opportunity lies is in our young people. If we can inform them and educate them, not shame them, but allow them to understand the harm that in the roles that they can play. I truly feel that they could have an opportunity in shifting this crime and less people being exploited.
I agree with you. We see young people engaging with one another in different ways as well. And I think that we oftentimes want to take the dialogue away from them, but I think that we need to engage them more in this dialogue and be really upfront with them and allow them to have real upfront conversations with us as adults as well as one another. That peer-to-peer relationship and peer-to-peer conversation, I think, is so key in the paradigm shift of how we see bodies and what we see female bodies being worth, or what we see marginalized individuals, vulnerable populations. And one of the groups we need to make sure we include in that description are folks with disabilities, because they often get left out of that conversation. And folks that have different types of disabilities, they are vulnerable to human trafficking as well. And whether that be labor trafficking or sex trafficking, they're an extraordinarily vulnerable population that are being taken advantage of. Thank you again, Louie, so much. You touched on so many good points. So appreciate your time. Appreciate the time with Truckers Against Trafficking and TAT, as you are known in the anti-trafficking world. Thank you again. And for our listeners, thank you for listening, and thank you for sharing this journey with us. Join us next week when our guest will be survivor advocate Julia Lilithan. If you suspect labor or sex trafficking in the state of Montana, please call 833-406-7867. If you are being trafficked and need help, please call 911. If you suspect labor or sex trafficking outside of the state of Montana, please call your regional FBI office. You may also call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 888-373-7888.